It happened in the blink of an eye, but that's all it took. One slip, one misstep on the freshly cut grass, and my daughter, my little girl with cerebral palsy, was face down on the pavement. Her braces clattered against the curb as she tried to shield her face with trembling arms. I shouted her name and dropped everything, my feet pounding the ground as I ran to her. But I wasn't the first one to react. Across the street, standing with her arms crossed and a phone gripped tightly in one hand, Karen didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of a shutter, a photo being taken. I remember freezing for a fraction of a second, my mind unable to process what I had just witnessed. She took a photo, not to help, not to report, but for her own amusement. My daughter whimpered as I reached her. Blood trickled from her lip, and her eyes were wide with confusion, not just from the fall, but from the silence that surrounded her. No one came. No neighbors ran over. No voices called out to check if she was okay. Just me, and her, and Karen, who was already typing something into her phone, thumbs moving rapidly. It was almost mechanical, like she'd done it before. Like this wasn't a tragedy to her, but content. A joke. A message. By the time I carried my daughter inside and began tending to her cuts and scrapes, I had tried to push the moment from my mind. Maybe I imagined the flash. Maybe she wasn't taking a picture. Maybe it wasn't as malicious as it seemed. I didn't want to believe anyone could be so cruel, especially in a neighborhood we had just moved into for a fresh start. But denial is a fragile wall, and mine shattered within the hour. A neighbor, one of the few who had welcomed us with a smile, forwarded me a screenshot. It was from the HOA group chat. Karen had posted the photo. My daughter's fall, her body frozen mid-collapse, arms out, hair flung forward. The caption read, HOA hazard of the month faced with tears of joy, followed by a string of laughing emojis. There it was, undeniable. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. My hands shook as I stared at the image. An image of my daughter in pain turned into entertainment for the very people who were supposed to be our neighbors. And the reactions? A few laughing emojis. One, Karen, you're too much. A thumbs up. Not a single message asking if she was okay. Not one. I stared at the screen as if it were some kind of alternate reality. Surely, this couldn't be happening in the real world. Not in the community we had hoped would become our safe haven. Not to a child. Not to my child. The rage came slow, boiling beneath the grief. I didn't know what I wanted more, to delete the image from existence or to confront Karen and demand answers. But I didn't move. I just sat there, my daughter asleep beside me with a bandage across her cheek and innocence still intact. She didn't know. Not yet. She thought the fall was just bad luck, not something used to mock her. Not something circulated as a joke. But I knew. And as the sun began to set that evening, casting long shadows through the blinds, something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't just about a photo. This was about cruelty wearing a smile. About power disguised as neighborhood rules. About an HOA president who saw herself as untouchable and a community too scared or too complicit to stand up. I stood up slowly, walked to my office, and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folder, old certifications, records, badges, my past life, before the quiet streets and trim lawns, before I stepped back from who I used to be. But that part of me, the one who fought for people, who stood up to injustice, that part wasn't dead, just dormant. And that night, I promised myself, she thinks it's just a joke. She thinks she can humiliate my daughter and walk away untouched. But she has no idea who I am. And she's about to find out. 3 months before that fall, we believed we were finally putting the pain behind us. After years of hospitals, specialists, and learning how to navigate a world that wasn't built for children like my daughter, we had found a home. Not just a house, a home. A quiet neighborhood in a highly rated school district, tree-lined streets, friendly porches, and promises of safety. My wife called it a reset button on our life, and honestly, I wanted to believe her. My daughter, Ava, was born with spastic cerebral palsy. Doctors told us she might never walk, never talk clearly. But they didn't know Ava. She was a fighter from the beginning. Every step she takes today, every word she forms, is the result of relentless therapy, late-night prayers, and her own unstoppable will. She has braces on her legs, but she insists on walking on her own. No help, Daddy. I can do it. That's her mantra. Our previous neighborhood wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. Stairs lingered too long. Parents shuffled their kids away from Ava like she was contagious. Birthday parties didn't come. Playdates never materialized. It felt like we were constantly walking on eggshells. No one said anything hurtful, but their silence screamed. We wanted better. We needed better. When we found Briarwood Grove, everything felt right. The real estate agent called it a close-knit HOA-managed gem and painted a picture of barbecues, community events, and friendly block parties. We toured the house on a Saturday morning, and Ava fell in love with the backyard swing set. That same day, Karen walked across the street with cookies and a clipboard. She introduced herself as the HOA president, and while something about her felt a little rehearsed, we appreciated the welcome. For the first few weeks, things were calm. We received a welcome packet, learned about trash pickup days, landscaping guidelines, mailbox painting schedules, standard HOA fare. I even smiled at Karen's emails and reminders. She seemed organized, if a bit rigid. We met a few other neighbors at the park. Ava especially liked an older boy named Liam, who offered to push her on the swing. But something shifted when Karen saw Ava trying to walk up the sidewalk to our front door. It was subtle, her smile stiffened, and her tone changed. Is everything okay with her? She asked, in that faux concerned voice people use when they're already judging. My wife explained Ava's condition gently. Karen nodded and then asked if we were aware of the HOA's sidewalk policies. That was our first red flag. Soon after, we started receiving notes. Not official letters, just Karen's handwriting in envelopes placed in our mailbox. Please remind your daughter not to leave chalk drawings on the driveway. It lowers curb appeal. Or, observed toys left unattended in the front yard. Kindly adhere to cleanliness standards. She never mentioned the dozens of plastic trucks and bikes scattered in other driveways. Just ours. We brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just particular. Maybe she treated everyone like this. But slowly we began to feel watched, judged. Every time Ava stumbled, we wondered if Karen was watching from her window. Every time we laughed too loudly on our porch, we wondered if we'd get another envelope. Still, we tried to stay positive. We didn't want to give up on Briarwood Grove. We hosted a small get-together for Ava's birthday in the backyard. We invited the neighborhood kids. Only one showed up, Liam, and he didn't stay long. Later, his mother apologized. We just didn't want any drama with the HOA, she said, without making eye contact. That was when we realized Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the neighborhood, and people feared her more than they respected her. What we thought was a community turned out to be a tightly controlled show, one where anything imperfect was quickly covered up, silenced, or shamed. But despite everything, we stayed. Because Ava loved the swing. Because my wife believed things could change. Because I wanted to give this place one last chance. Until the day Karen took that photo. At first, Karen's notes felt like minor irritations. Nothing serious, just overly enthusiastic reminders from someone clearly too invested in HOA bylaws. The first one came 3 days after we moved in. A neat, white envelope slipped into our mailbox with no stamp and no signature. Inside was a sticky note that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood." Just a quick tip. We don't usually leave recycling bins out past 7 p.m. smiling face with smiling eyes. Kate, we laughed about it over dinner. It didn't feel like a warning, more like an overzealous welcome. But then came the second note, and the third, and the fourth. Always unsigned, always polite on the surface. But the smiley faces began to feel more like smirks. Soon, Karen was everywhere. Not just in person, but in spirit. If Ava left her walker near the garage for more than a few minutes, a note appeared. If we parked on the curb instead of in the driveway during a grocery run, a note appeared. Once, My wife forgot to roll down the garbage bin after a stormy night. The next morning, the bin had been pulled to the curb, and taped to it was a laminated HOA printout titled Keeping Briarwood Beautiful. It was all done under the guise of friendliness. Karen was never confrontational. She'd smile wide and wave every time she saw us. She even gave Ava a coloring book once, except it was full of pictures of flowers and trimmed hedges titled My Perfect Neighborhood. Subtle, but not subtle. One afternoon, Ava was trying to chalk butterflies onto the sidewalk. She'd drawn a crooked little heart with her name inside it. I was sitting on the steps watching her when Karen walked by. She paused, tilted her head, and said, "So creative." Then, after a beat, though technically sidewalk art is considered vandalism under Section 9B of our HOA guidelines, I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. It never came. That night, another note. Please encourage your daughter to enjoy her art in designated areas, i.e. backyard or park chalk zone. Thanks in advance. I wanted to believe we were overreacting, that maybe Karen was just a perfectionist, that maybe every new family gets this treatment. But the more I observed, the clearer it became. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. And Karen's target wasn't me or my wife, it was Ava. She didn't like Ava's stumbling walk. She didn't like her laughter. She didn't like her presence outside, because Ava didn't fit into Karen's brochure-perfect vision of Briarwood Grove. And instead of compassion, Karen weaponized the rules. She used them like a scalpel, cutting away at us, one paper-thin complaint at a time. I started to notice how other families seemed careful around Karen. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Parents redirected their kids if they were running too loud or playing with the wrong toys on the grass. Everyone wore a polite mask, and behind that mask was fear. Karen didn't need to raise her voice. She had power, HOA bylaws, influence, a digital group chat where she controlled the narrative. And no one wanted to be her next target, except we already were. Then came the camera. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Karen would walk her dog, always at the same time Ava went outside, and stop at the edge of our yard. Her phone would be out, pointed downward, maybe checking email, maybe recording. Then, one evening, I saw her actually zoom in. Ava had just lost her balance and sat down hard on the grass. Karen paused, lifted her phone slightly, and took a photo. I stepped toward her. She walked off, smiling and humming like nothing happened. I told myself it was paranoia, that maybe she wasn't doing what I feared, that maybe I was just being defensive as a father. But deep down I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Karen wasn't just monitoring us. She was documenting us. And one day, she was going to use it. It was a breezy Thursday afternoon, one of those rare days where everything felt calm for once. The sun wasn't too harsh, the air smelled of freshly watered grass, and Ava had been in a good mood all morning. She'd just finished her therapy session and wanted to walk by herself to the mailbox, something that had become her little victory routine. I usually walked beside her in case she stumbled, but that day, she insisted on doing it solo. I stayed on the porch, letting her be brave, keeping a watchful but distant eye. She was halfway down the sidewalk, her little braces clicking rhythmically with each determined step, when I noticed Karen, standing across the street, phone out, watching again. I felt the familiar sting of irritation rise in my chest, but I stayed put. Ava hadn't even noticed her. She was focused on the mailbox, like it was a summit she had to conquer. A few more steps. She smiled up at the sky, wobbled slightly, adjusted herself, and then it happened. One of her braces caught the edge of a crack in the pavement. It wasn't deep, just slightly raised, but it was enough. Her foot twisted, her balance failed, and before I could even shout her name, Ava fell forward. Her body hit the ground hard. Her cheek scraped the concrete. Her small palm slammed down to brace the fall, and she let out a high, sudden cry, the kind that breaks every cell inside a parent's body. I was already off the porch, running toward her. My heart raced, not just from panic, but from guilt. I should have been beside her. I should have seen it coming. But mid-run, I caught a glimpse of Karen. She hadn't moved to help. She hadn't shouted. She didn't even flinch. She lifted her phone and snapped a photo. That single sound, click, echoed louder in my ears than Ava's cry. It froze me, just for a second, long enough for her to look up from the screen, smirk in my direction, and walk away. No words, no concern, just the image on her phone and that chilling smile. I scooped Ava into my arms. She was crying, her hands shaking, her lip bleeding. I kissed her forehead, telling her she was okay even as my own voice trembled. I carried her back inside, cleaned her wounds, and rocked her gently until the sobs quieted into exhausted breathing. She fell asleep in my arms. I wanted to believe Karen hadn't meant to do it, that maybe she was documenting the cracked pavement for a maintenance report, that maybe the photo wasn't even of Ava, that maybe I hadn't just witnessed something so inhuman. But the universe doesn't grant the benefit of the doubt for long. An hour later, I got the message. One of the kinder neighbors, Michelle, forwarded me a screenshot from the HOA group chat. Karen had posted the photo. A full shot of Ava mid-fall, her body halfway collapsed, mouth open in pain, one shoe flung off. It was unblurred, unedited, raw. Beneath the photo, Karen had written, "Looks like we've got a tripping hazard on the loose face with tears of joy. Someone call maintenance." 3 laughing emojis. Then one of those stickers people use that say, #JustKarenThings. And the comments, they weren't shocked. They weren't angry. They joined in. "Oh my God, face with tears of joy classic. Y'all better fix that crack before it sues. Poor pavement. No one asked if Ava was okay. No one wondered if maybe, just maybe, that photo wasn't appropriate." I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. My daughter's pain had become punchline material for people who called themselves neighbors. And Karen, she had crossed a line that no apology could ever fix. It wasn't just a photo. It was proof. Proof that Karen didn't just dislike our presence. She enjoyed humiliating us. She saw my daughter not as a child overcoming adversity, but as an inconvenience to her pristine world. Something to mock. Something to capture, not comfort. And in that moment, something inside me cracked, not like pavement, but like armor. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Karen thought she was powerful because she ran a group chat, wore a clipboard, and quoted HOA codes like scripture. But she didn't know who I was. She didn't know what I was capable of when it came to protecting my daughter. And she was about to learn. The moment the screenshot hit my phone, the illusion shattered. For weeks, I had tried to convince myself that Karen was just overbearing, that her obsession with rules, appearances, and HOA order was just a personality quirk. But the image on my screen, my daughter mid-fall, caught in the rawest moment of her young life, paired with the sickening caption and chorus of laughter, burned that last bit of restraint out of me. The file name read, HOA_gems.jpg. As if this cruelty was part of a collection, the caption below it, new record for most dramatic sidewalk dive, grinning squinting face, #not ADA compliant much, should we install a slippery child sign? It felt like being punched repeatedly in the chest while tied to a chair. I wasn't angry. I was devastated, enraged, humiliated. And the worst part? The laughter didn't come from just Karen. A few names in the thread were people we'd spoken to, people we had waved to on walks. One of them had eaten a slice of Ava's birthday cake, and yet not one voice in that chat said, "Hey, maybe this isn't okay. Is she all right? Why are we mocking a child?" I sat still for a long time, the glow of my phone's screen burning into my eyes. I looked at Ava, who was curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket, watching cartoons and unaware that she had become a digital spectacle, that strangers, neighbors, were laughing at her fall like it was a blooper reel. Then came the text from Michelle, the one neighbor who still had a soul. "I don't want to start drama, but I thought you should see this. I'm so sorry." I called her instantly. Her voice trembled. I was horrified, she said. I left the chat after that. I couldn't believe it. She went quiet, then added, "Karen thinks because she's HOA president, she can get away with anything. No one calls her out because, well, she bites back." That's when it clicked. This wasn't the first time. Karen had been doing this for years. Maybe not always with photos, but with the same poison, sarcastic comments, public shaming, quiet cruelty disguised as community enforcement. She had shaped Briarwood Grove into her own personal fiefdom, and everyone else had learned to play along or be exiled. I asked Michelle how many people were in the chat. 23, she said, mostly board members and preferred residents, Karen's favorites. That was all I needed to hear. I thanked her and hung up, then stared at the image again. My daughter didn't deserve this. No child did, and certainly not from adults who should have known better. I felt the father in me rise, the protector, the warrior I hadn't needed to be in years. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about justice, accountability, dignity. So I started taking screenshots, not just of the post, but of the reactions, the usernames, the timestamps. I printed them out, archived them in folders, and backed everything up in cloud storage. If they wanted a digital war, I was more than prepared. I sent the image to a disability rights attorney I once worked with during a volunteer campaign. Her response came in minutes. This isn't just morally wrong. It's legally actionable. Want to talk? Yes, I did. But first, I needed to do something more immediate. I needed to look Karen in the eyes. The next day, I showed up at the HOA meeting not as a neighbor, not as a newcomer, but as a man whose daughter had been exploited and who had the receipts. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I printed the image, passed it around, let the silence do the work. Eyes widened. Some gasped. Karen paled. And I said, calmly, "This is your president. This is what your leadership looks like. You all let it happen. But that ends now." The fallout at home wasn't immediate. That's what made it harder. Ava didn't know what had happened, not fully. She just knew she had fallen, scraped her face, and that I was holding her tighter than usual. She didn't understand why Mommy suddenly started crying in the kitchen while trying to cook dinner. She didn't understand why I kept checking my phone, or why the neighbors we used to wave at now looked away as they passed by. We didn't tell her right away. We didn't know how. How do you explain to a child, your own child, that someone photographed their pain and turned it into a joke for the world to laugh at? That someone you trusted to run your neighborhood saw your child as entertainment? But children sense things, even when you try to protect them. 2 days later, Ava asked a question that shattered us. "Daddy, am I funny when I fall?" I froze. My wife dropped the dish she was drying, and it shattered on the floor. Ava looked between us, confused, as if trying to understand what she had done wrong. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" I said, kneeling beside her. She shrugged. Because the neighbor lady laughed when I fell. I saw her. Then she whispered, "I didn't mean to fall." It felt like my lungs collapsed. I hugged her so tightly I worried I might hurt her. My wife joined me on the floor, arms around both of us. We sat like that for a long time, just the three of us, in silence, grief quietly spreading through the room like smoke. That night, my wife broke. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, her voice hollow. This place was supposed to be our peace, our fresh start. How did we end up right back where we started, only worse? I had no answer, because truthfully I felt the same. I carried the guilt of Ava's fall like a weight in my chest, but now it had grown into something heavier. A shame I didn't deserve, but couldn't shake. Every moment replayed in my head. Every time I'd ignored a Karen comment. Every time I'd told myself not to overreact. Every warning sign I excused as maybe she didn't mean it that way. I had allowed it to escalate, and my daughter paid the price. My wife withdrew from the community overnight. She stopped waving to neighbors. She stopped attending local meetings. She even asked if we should homeschool Ava again, just in case someone else noticed her. I told her no, absolutely not. We were not going to shrink again, but it was harder for Ava. She didn't want to go outside anymore. The swing set sat untouched. Her favorite chalk was dried out and left in a box. She said her legs were tired, but I knew better. She wasn't scared of falling. She was scared of being laughed at. That's when I knew this wasn't just about confronting Karen anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity. This had become bigger than a group chat, bigger than a photo. It was about what happens when cruelty is tolerated long enough to feel normal, when adults forget they are being watched by children who feel everything. I couldn't allow Karen's poison to spread into Ava's spirit. So I began documenting everything. Every note Karen had left us, every photo she had taken, every message forwarded from the HOA group chat. I filed a report not just with the HOA board, but with the local ADA compliance officer. I reached out to special needs advocacy groups, explained what had happened, and started getting responses fast. People cared. Not everyone in this neighborhood was like Karen, but too many had been silent. And I wasn't going to be. Because the greatest damage Karen caused wasn't to Ava's body, it was to her confidence, her sense of safety in her own front yard. But she underestimated something. Ava isn't weak. She's a fighter. And she has a father who remembers exactly who he is. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who dug through neighborhood politics and personal history just to protect his family. But Karen made me that man. She left me no choice. And once I started pulling the thread, the whole fabric of her carefully constructed image began to unravel. The first thing I found was public, harmless on the surface. Karen was president of the HOA for 5 years running. No one had ever run against her. Each year, the elections were unopposed and unadvertised. The same board, the same faces, the same power. When I asked a neighbor why she'd never considered running, she laughed nervously and said, "Run against Karen. You're brave." Brave? What exactly did Karen do to people who stood up to her? So I started asking the right questions. Michelle put me in touch with a family who used to live just 2 streets over. The wife's voice was brittle when we spoke on the phone. She said her son was autistic and liked to walk in small circles in their front yard. It helped him regulate his sensory input. Karen had once snapped a photo of him and sent it to the board with a subject line that read, "Loitering or mental case?" They moved out 3 months later. That was strike 1. Strike 2 came from an old board member, retired now, and no longer living in the community. He told me Karen kept compliance folders on residents she didn't like. Screenshots, photos, timestamps. If she wanted you gone, she'd build a case bit by bit and submit it as a concern for property value. She'd use these tactics to push out a single mother, an interracial couple, even an elderly man who had too many lawn gnomes. Her strategy? Use the rules not to protect the community, but to control it. And if someone didn't fit her narrow mold of respectable suburbia, she found a way to shame them into silence or exile. Strike 3 hit closer to home. I was going through archived HOA newsletters when I found one from a year ago. A child with Down syndrome had apparently been the subject of community concern over loud noises during playtime. Karen had written the letter herself. She never named the child, but her language was unmistakable. While we value all members of our neighborhood, we must ensure that outdoor activities align with a peaceful community atmosphere. The child's family moved within a month. I realized then that what Karen did to Ava wasn't an isolated event. It was a pattern. A long, quiet war she had waged on anyone who made her feel uncomfortable or out of control. And she always wore the same mask, that of the overly concerned, always smiling president just doing her job. But not this time. Because this time, the father of the child she tried to humiliate wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't going to bow down or move out quietly. He wasn't going to just let it go. And he had a background Karen hadn't accounted for. You see, before I was a suburban dad with a lawn to mow and a mailbox to paint, I was a civil rights investigator. I spent 12 years documenting abuse cases, filing federal reports, and taking down institutions that thought they were untouchable. Karen? She was nothing new to me. She was just smaller, meaner, and happened to hold a clipboard instead of a badge. So, I opened a folder on her, a real one. I compiled witness testimonies, printed emails, collected policy violations, and highlighted ADA breaches. I drafted a formal complaint and addressed it to the state HOA Oversight Committee. I added a legal cover letter and copied it to a national disability advocacy firm. And then I made one final move. I wrote an open letter, personal, honest, painful, and submitted it to a popular suburban parent blog under the headline, "When the neighborhood turns against your disabled child." It went viral within 24 hours. By the end of the week, I wasn't just a quiet neighbor anymore. I was the storm Karen never saw coming. The legal engine didn't roar to life, it rumbled low and steady. The kind of sound that makes someone like Karen shift in her chair before she even knows why. The morning after my open letter went viral, I received an email from a regional disability rights firm. They had read the story, seen the screenshots, and were already in touch with other families who'd suffered under Karen's HOA leadership. "You're not alone," the message said, "and it's time someone challenged this legally." I agreed without hesitation. Our first move was straightforward: file an official ADA discrimination complaint with the state. Ava's rights had been violated the moment Karen used her disability as public mockery. The fact that it was shared in an official HOA group chat made it even worse. It wasn't private gossip, it was systemic humiliation under the HOA's digital letterhead. Next came a cease and desist order, not just for Karen, but the HOA board as a whole. It demanded they immediately remove the offending content, issue a formal apology, and suspend all HOA-related communication involving Ava or our family until further notice. Karen, of course, didn't respond well. She fired back with her own letter, riddled with self-righteous phrases like, "It was meant as humor. No personal harm was intended. This is a case of hypersensitivity." Then she made a fatal mistake. She tried to flip the narrative in the neighborhood newsletter. A full-page letter appeared in that week's HOA bulletin titled, "In Defense of Order and Harmony." Karen claimed she had been unjustly targeted for her leadership and that certain families were attempting to weaponize emotional manipulation to escape HOA standards. She didn't name us, but she didn't need to. The next day, my legal team sent her a notice of defamation. Karen had poked the bear, and now the bear was armed with attorneys, documentation, and public support. But the most unexpected blow came not from a lawyer, but from within her own ranks. Two members of the HOA board, quiet ones who'd been in her shadow for years, resigned publicly and issued statements condemning her behavior. They admitted that Karen had been warned internally multiple times over her treatment of families with disabled children. One of them even shared old meeting minutes that had been conveniently left out of the public record. Suddenly, the legal case wasn't just ours, it was snowballing into a potential class action. I held a meeting at our home. We invited every family who had ever been targeted, silenced, or shamed by Karen's leadership. Some were cautious at first, unsure if they'd face retaliation. But one by one they came, they spoke, they cried, and they brought receipts, photos, emails, testimonies. A mother who was fined for too many garden toys. A veteran with PTSD who was harassed for putting blackout curtains in his bedroom. A teenager with Tourette's who was mocked by Karen for causing disturbances. We weren't just victims. We were witnesses, allies, a united front. Meanwhile, Ava, she still hadn't returned to the sidewalk. She peeked out sometimes, wondering if it was safe again. I promised her it would be, that I would make it safe again. So, we made another move. We submitted a formal petition to suspend Karen as HOA president, backed by 35 signatures, well beyond the required minimum. We requested an emergency hearing. The board had no choice. Karen would have to face the community. But she wasn't going quietly. She showed up to the hearing with her own lawyer, dressed in a beige pantsuit and clinging to a binder full of policies. She tried to control the room like she always had, smiling, talking fast, deflecting. But it didn't work this time. Not when I stood up and read aloud Ava's words. I didn't mean to fall. I just wanted to walk to the mailbox. Not when the crowd saw the photo Karen took projected onto the community center screen and censored, unfiltered, cruel. Not when a boy with autism in the crowd whispered, "She did that to me too." Karen's face crumbled, and for the first time, the community turned not away but against her. Karen didn't expect me to confront her face to face. Not really. She'd grown used to ruling through distance, Emails, newsletters, passive-aggressive notes slid into mailboxes under the cloak of HOA authority. But this time was different. This time, the HOA meeting wasn't in her carefully curated living room or behind a private group chat firewall. This time, she was standing at the front of the community center, facing a room full of people she'd underestimated for too long. And I was at the front of that crowd. The atmosphere was thick, almost electric. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Neighbors who had once mumbled greetings now sat upright, arms crossed, jaws tight. Some of them clutched printed copies of the photo she took. Others whispered to each other, trading stories of being fined, shamed, belittled. Karen stood there, tight-lipped, arms crossed, her clipboard missing for the first time in years. I stepped forward and looked her in the eyes. "Karen," I said, "you took a picture of my daughter in the moment of her pain. Not to help, not to protect, but to laugh." She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "I'm not finished." You could hear a pin drop. She's a little girl who's already had to fight harder than most people in this room ever will. She has cerebral palsy, and every step she takes is an act of courage. And you turned her fall, her private moment of hurt, into neighborhood gossip. You posted it. You captioned it. You laughed. I took out the printed screenshot and held it up high. This is what you did." Karen tried to shift gears. It was just meant as a lighthearted moment. People are too sensitive these days. I didn't mean any harm. A voice from the back cut in. "You said the same thing about my son when you called his stimmying distracting." Karen turned, startled. Then another voice. "You fined us for having wind chimes. Said they were chaotic. And you told my husband our curtains made the block look cheap," someone else added. One by one, the room turned vocal. Karen spun in place like a cornered animal, eyes darting toward the HOA board for rescue. But even they looked away. No one was coming to her defense anymore. I stepped closer. Not threatening, truthful. "I was a civil rights investigator, Karen," I said quietly so she could hear me and no one else. "I've dealt with organizations bigger, nastier, and more powerful than you. And every time, the same thing took them down, arrogance." I paused, then said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "You thought no one would speak up, that no one would fight back. You were wrong." She tried one last card. "I still have rights. This is harassment." A board member stood up. "This is accountability. You've run this neighborhood like your own kingdom for too long. That ends now." The room erupted in quiet applause. Nothing wild, nothing theatrical, just firm, approving, united. Karen didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply lowered her head, her facade finally crumbling beneath the weight of truth and consequence. She walked out of that meeting alone, no allies trailing behind her, no clipboard clutched to her chest. For the first time, she wasn't the one controlling the narrative. We had reclaimed it. The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote. Karen was suspended pending a formal board review. In the meantime, a temporary president would be appointed. A woman named Rosa, a soft-spoken, kind neighbor who once brought Ava flowers on her birthday. When I returned home that night, I sat on the porch steps, heart still pounding. Ava tiptoed outside, stood next to me quietly and said, "Did you make the lady stop?" I looked at her, smiled, and said, "She won't bother you again." Ava nodded once and sat beside me. "Can I walk to the mailbox tomorrow?" I looked out at the pavement, now lit with the soft glow of the porch light, and answered without hesitation. "Yes, baby. Yes, you can." The HOA didn't fall in one big explosion. It cracked slowly and publicly like glass under pressure, until one final hit shattered everything. In the days following the confrontation, Karen disappeared from sight. Her car stayed in the garage. Her porch light never came on. The once daily HOA email stopped. No notes, no newsletters, no snide group chat messages. It was as if the neighborhood exhaled for the first time in years. But the silence didn't mean peace. It meant reckoning. The newly appointed interim president, Rosa, wasted no time. Within 48 hours, she called for an emergency audit of all HOA communications from the past 5 years. She opened the books, digitally and financially, and what she found blew the lid off everything. Dozens of informal fines with no record of board votes. Handwritten violations Karen issued without proper documentation. HOA funds used for expenses like neighborhood beautification brunches, parking citation envelopes, and bizarrely, clipboard replacements. But what shocked everyone most was the digital communications log. The private HOA Slack channel, fought to be deleted, had been quietly archived on the server. Every sarcastic comment, every cruel meme, every joke Karen and her inner circle had passed around, not just about Ava, but about others. The widower who forgot to mow for a week after his wife passed, the disabled vet who installed a small ramp without pre-approval, the family with the biracial children, ruining the symmetry of block photos. Karen didn't just abuse her power. She weaponized it. News traveled fast. Local news stations picked up the story after someone anonymously forwarded the group chat logs. The headlines read, HOA president under fire for mocking disabled child in viral photo scandal toxic suburbia. When leadership crosses the line, dad fights back after daughter becomes target of neighborhood shame campaign. One by one, the people who once stayed silent began to speak. Letters poured into the HOA office. Complaints once whispered were now printed and signed. And as the pressure mounted, 3 more board members resigned, citing emotional exhaustion and inability to continue under a tainted leadership legacy. By week's end, Rosa made it official. A full re-election of the HOA board would be held. Every position would be open, and this time it would be public. The people cheered. Literally, a neighborhood that had once been silent out of fear now gathered on front lawns to talk openly, something I hadn't seen since we moved in. Kids played freely again. Music played from porches. Someone even chalked a huge, colorful sign on the sidewalk that read, "We read Heart, Ava, it nearly broke me." But Karen wasn't done, not quite. She tried to mount a defense online, writing a rambling Facebook post claiming her rights had been violated, that she was a victim of a targeted character assassination campaign. The comments weren't kind. People weren't buying it anymore. Because here's the thing about power built on fear. Once the fear is gone, so is the power. The final nail in the coffin came when the state's HOA Oversight Committee issued an official investigation into Karen's tenure, citing at least 3 confirmed violations of ADA compliance laws and misuse of HOA funds. If found guilty, she could face personal fines and permanent disqualification from any future board position. Her reign was over, but our healing had just begun. One morning, Ava walked out with me to the mailbox holding my hand. She didn't hesitate this time. She didn't look over her shoulder. She walked slow, steady, proud. When we reached the end of the path, I looked at her and smiled. "You did it." She grinned. "I didn't fall this time." I knelt down beside her and said, "Even if you did, it wouldn't matter. Falling isn't failure. Staying down is." She nodded, wise beyond her years. And in that moment, I realized this whole fight, this entire painful public ordeal, it wasn't just about ending Karen's reign. It was about making sure no one like her ever rose again. Not in this neighborhood. Not on my watch. Redemption doesn't come in applause. It doesn't come in lawsuits or headlines. It comes in quiet mornings, in healing moments, in the little victories you once feared were gone forever. For us, it started with chalk. Ava came to me a few days after the HOA vote with her art box tucked under one arm. She looked hesitant. "Can I draw on the sidewalk again?" she asked, almost whispering, like she wasn't sure if the rules had really changed. I knelt beside her and smiled. "Sweetheart, you can paint the whole neighborhood if you want." She picked pink and blue first, her favorite colors, and began sketching soft spirals and wobbly stars across the concrete. For the first time since her fall, she didn't look over her shoulder once. She didn't wait for a camera flash. She was just a child again. Free. My wife watched from the porch, tears in her eyes. But this time, they weren't from fear. They were from relief, from gratitude, from a weight being lifted that we had all carried for too long. Rosa, the new HOA president, stopped by that afternoon. Not with a clipboard, but with 2 cupcakes and a letter. The cupcakes were for Ava. The letter was for us. It read, "We can't undo what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again. From now on, this neighborhood will be a place of inclusion, not intimidation. Thank you for standing up, not just for Ava, but for all of us." The change wasn't just symbolic. New HOA policies were drafted and voted on unanimously, no anonymous fines. A formal complaints board with community oversight. A diversity and inclusion officer elected. Clear ADA protections written into the bylaws. A zero-tolerance policy on digital harassment under the HOA's name. And the group chat? Deleted. Replaced with a community forum moderated by real people, not self-appointed tyrants. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet now greeted us with warmth. Some apologized genuinely. Not everyone had been cruel. Many had simply been afraid. I understood that now, but fear doesn't excuse silence. And thanks to this, maybe next time, they'd speak up sooner. Even the kids changed. Liam, the boy from down the street who had once drifted away from Ava to avoid drama, showed up at our door one evening with a handmade card. It was messy, colorful, and perfect. "Sorry your fall got shared. That was mean. Want to play again?" Ava beamed and ran out the door without even putting on shoes. We didn't stop her, because this was the life we moved here to find. Not perfection, but community. One where differences weren't punished, where compassion was louder than rules, and where people looked out for one another instead of looking down. As for Karen, we heard she moved out quietly 2 months later. No farewell notes, no final newsletters, just a for sale sign on her perfectly trimmed lawn and a moving truck that came and went in a single afternoon. Word is she's trying to join another HOA in a neighboring county. I wish them luck, but I also hope they read my letter first, because this wasn't just about Briarwood Grove. This was a wake-up call to every community that's allowed petty power to go unchecked, to every board member who thinks rules are more important than people, to every parent who's had to defend their child from cruelty disguised as policy. We didn't just recover, we rebuilt, and we emerged stronger than we were before. The final chalk drawing Ava made that week was a big, colorful heart. In the middle, she wrote one word in her wobbly handwriting, "safe." And finally, for the first time since we moved in, she was right. If you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for watching, but for witnessing what so many families like mine quietly endure behind the polished fences and manicured lawns of HOA-run neighborhoods. What happened to Ava wasn't just about a fall or a photo. It was about power unchecked, about silence mistaken for peace, about what happens when cruelty is masked as order. I made this video because I know we're not alone. If you've ever been bullied by a board, fined for being different, or made to feel like you and your family were a problem instead of people, then this story is yours too. And if your child has ever been laughed at, excluded, or turned into a joke for simply existing, then you already understand why I couldn't stay silent. So here's what I want to say to you, the person watching this right now. Speak up, even if your voice shakes, even if you're the only one in the room, even if they tell you to just let it go. Because silence is what people like Karen rely on. And every time we choose discomfort over confrontation, the Karens of the world grow stronger. But they're not unstoppable. One photo, one cruel joke, that's all it took to spark a reckoning, not just in my neighborhood, but in me. And what started as a fall became a rise, a movement, a message that we will no longer allow disability to be disrespected. That kindness is not weakness. That parents will protect their children with everything they have. So, if you're a parent, a neighbor, or someone who just knows deep down that right matters, then join us. Share your story in the comments. Let your voice be louder than the clipboard. Let people know that HOA rules should never come before human dignity. And if you've ever felt like your family didn't belong, you belong here. Because this channel, HOA Denied Access, isn't just about exposing abuse. It's about building something better, together. Bell subscribe. Writing and leave your story. Loudspeaker share this video. Let's show the world what happens when the quiet ones finally speak. Because falling doesn't define us, rising does.